there is more and more evidence that there is an immune inflammatory process going on in more than 80% of these children. Find a doctor who understands that autism is medical.
I forget that I see this kind of stuff every day, and I forget that people that don't see these kids every day and see them better don't know that that can happen.
I started to read many journal articles. Come to find out there were many journal articles that the doctors weren't reading.
What's going on? Why is it going on? How did this happen?
Most of the research dollars were going into genetics, and I knew there had to be an environmental factor. Gluten intolerance is glyphosate poisoning.
We're bathed in chemicals. Look around you.
We're physically poisoning the earth, and we're physically poisoning the children.
You hear from your conventionally trained doctor that diet has no influence on autism. That's nonsense.
And if you can fix what's wrong with the gut, then your child can learn what they couldn't before.
So we started hitting new levels.
Within 48 hours, he had gone from completely nonverbal, no sounds that even remotely sounded like the English language, to speaking in sentences.
What's that from? What's that from?
Where's that from? Mr. Grasshopper. Which color wiring can do you like?
Flip the right switch and miracles can happen.
Oh my goodness, there's something I can do about this. This is an autoimmune disorder. This is a metabolic disorder. This is a digestive disorder.
It helped me with my life. It actually did. And I think that's just amazing.
And I strongly suggest you open your eyes to possibilities.
What we've done is taken away the things that held them back and made them sick and made them, unable to face the world. Now we're able to see who they really are, and it's beautiful. It's amazing.
Which is possible your child actually is a genius.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's Restoring Balance Autism Redefined Q&A follow-up panel. We're really excited to have you all here today. We did have a movie screening and then a Q&A panel that we're very grateful was also streamed to chd.tv. And so we had a lot of interest and a lot of people that showed up live, in person, and online. And so we wanted to give more time for our panelists to answer questions and go more into depth about some of these topics on how to best help these children and help children on the spectrum to thrive and feel better in their brains and in their body. So I'm going to have Ryan come on briefly, and he's going to talk a little bit about why he created this movie. And then I just wanted to acknowledge the CHD.TV team and the Children's Health Defense of Arizona chapter team and thank them all for all of their help and support and all of our volunteers helping in the background as well. We're really grateful for them for helping us live stream this event. So Ryan, if you want to talk a little bit about the movie, where they can find it, and introduce it. And Ryan is the filmmaker and producer director of the movie Restoring Balance Autism Redefined.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I appreciate Children's Health Defense hosting this important discussion. I think it helps to have a lot of voices here to get a broad perspective. So I started working, the way this film was developed, started working with autism in the behavioral therapy world with ABA. And, from there, I discovered a family who was doing things differently. And whenever I started seeing this child improve in all these other areas that we weren't working on for his ABA therapy, I started asking the family, what's happening? Are you doing something different? Because I asked if she noticed how much he was improving, and she sort of laughed that she knew this secret kind of behind my back, and she didn't tell me on purpose because the mom wanted to see, if I noticed without any prompting. And, that little boy, Theodore, took me down a journey of realizing that this information wasn't as commonplace as it should be. I tried to talk to colleagues in the behavioral world about it, and no one had really heard of it before. So, I thought that they will only believe really when seeing it all in one place, when you see the testimonials, when you see the practitioners, the lovely animation from Charlie Canfield really starts to put all of those pieces together. And so I really hope that you can, use this film for motivation. Like pumping yourself up, it takes association, and you have to be in this for the long term game. So you're going to need family and friends to be on board with you, and sometimes that's hard to do, and that's what this movie is for, so that you don't have to show them all these research papers and make them read a bunch of information or books. It's conveniently here in a documentary that can introduce them to biomedical treatment, and we'll go over what that means. But I really want you to try to watch it more than once to solidify these concepts, not for just compliance in changing hard things, but emotional support. Like I said, the other families, they will bring you up, they will empower you, and watching them. And, as you get more of your family and friends on board, instead of the resistance that they give, they can also help empower you, through this journey and through this success, because there's some ups and downs.
So why don't we go ahead and move on to introducing the panelists. Okay, so the first person was the person that would just talk, Ryan Hetrick. So he is the film producer and director of Restoring Balance, Autism Redefined. Next, we have Dr. Sean Centers, who is professor of pediatrics and osteopathic manipulative medicine. And he's also a homeopath, the director of the Integrative Hope Center of Arizona down in Phoenix. And he's also the former medical director of Autism One. Samantha is a biomedical mom who helped her children to thrive using biomedical approaches, holistic approaches, from neurodivergent symptoms. And so she's going to be telling us a little bit about her journey and providing a perspective from a mom. But she's also the head of operations of Moms Across America. And she's also the executive director of Red Rock Wild School. Dr. Adams is he's the director of the Autism Asperger's Institute at ASU, and he's been doing research on biomedical approaches for autism and publishing a lot of studies on how diet and nutrition can help these kids. He also runs a diagnostic company for autism, as well as he created a supplement a company called Autism Nutrition Research Company, so he's the director of that. And he holds quite a few other hats. So we're very lucky to have him as well. And lastly, I'm on the panel, so I'm here. I'm going to be helping to moderate the panel. But my name is Julie Lapidus, and I am the CEO and founder of Autism Evolution. And I'm currently in the process of publishing a book with Skyhorse and Children's Health Defense on autism, on the causes of autism and how to address it. And the working title is The Autism Generation. So that's a little bit about each of our panelists. We have quite a list of questions, and we have quite a few questions already from the audience. So we're going to go ahead and jump in.
The first question is to explain what biomedical means. And perhaps either Dr. Adams or Dr. Centers could take a crack at that. What is biomedical about how we're treating autism?
Biomedical is an approach that looks at the biological and biochemical aspects of autism. Biology and medicine, the biological approach or the biochemical approach to dealing with autism, because what we found is that autism is not simply a psychological disorder or a loss of neurological function. There's actually biochemical pathways that are involved. And if we can correct some of those pathways, then the child improves. And that's what we've seen over and over again for the last 20 years.
And so do these protocols include some pharmaceuticals potentially, as well as the diet changes? I'm trying to figure out what the umbrella is.
The thing that's probably most researched and probably the most effective is the dietary interventions. So, for example, when we remove casein and gluten and soy, 80% of the patients improve by just doing those simple things. And I say simple, but it's not really simple. It's actually very complicated, and it's hard to remove those things from the patient's diet.
You know, I think with biomedical, I know that right now it's, you know, diagnosed in sort of a behavioral and clinical sense. And so hopefully that the general population, you know, can use a film like this to start to understand how much the biomedical can affect the behavior. You know, I just wanted to highlight how, like in a practical sense, in the movie, we see several young men. Unfortunately, you know, sometimes with autism, there's the self-injurious behavior, and some of the young men, you know, are hitting themselves in the head. And behaviorally, we try to ask ourselves why, what's going on? Are they trying to tell us something? And it could be a lot harder if they're a non-speaker. But the situation with that is usually biomedical in basis, maybe not all the time, but many children have exclaimed, you know, that they had a headache or they felt better, you know, maybe once those foods are removed or once certain biomedical treatment is done. And so, you know, it's, I think it's something that we really want to look for to change. And maybe if Dr. Adams can expand, like I know he had done a discovery, developed a new urinalysis test for the yeast metabolites and bacterial toxins for diagnosis. And so I think that's cutting edge. So, you know, maybe he would like to explain some more on that.
Sure. Well, there are many parts to biomedical interventions. I think the way to differentiate it from other treatments is that back in the 60s and 70s, it was believed that autism was due to mothers hating and abusing their children. And that was the theory at the time. And then we began developing behavioral therapies, which are helpful in many cases, but then realizing that there's a lot more going on biologically. So one of the issues, as was mentioned, is food allergies. You know, to realize that the problem isn't necessarily the food, but the immune system reaction to it. So most people can eat peanuts, but to some people, a peanut could kill you, not because the peanut's poisonous, but because the body reacts to it in an extreme way. So there are many common allergenic foods, and as Dr. Centers was saying, gluten and casein are certainly two of the most common ones for autism, but there are many others as well. So one of the areas we've been working on is the nutrition side. I can talk about that later, but also what was just discussed is we have a new study, which we just submitted the paper on yesterday, showing that about 90% of children with autism have very high levels of metabolites, toxic metabolites from bacteria and yeast in their gut. There are over 40 studies, published research studies about these metabolites, just one of them, P-cresol, 17 published studies. Every study agrees there are high levels of this toxic chemical produced by gut bacteria, and that we know in animals that toxin can cause autistic symptoms in animals. We know that giving a gut transplant from a healthy mouse allows those mice to recover. And that's why we've been doing that sort of work in children with autism, that if giving a gut transplant can help a mouse, we find it can help a child if we do it right.
How did you get involved in autism?
I have a daughter with autism, and so she's now 33 years old, and that's what motivated me. When she was first diagnosed, we knew very little about the causes of autism, how to treat it, how to prevent it. Our physician said we had no idea, just a matter of time until we'd have to institutionalize her. So my wife and I brought her home and loved her and accepted her as she was as best we could. But then my wife went to a conference by Bernie Rimland, our hero, and learned about vitamin and mineral therapies to help children with autism. I was very skeptical at the time. I said, we've known about vitamin and minerals for 50 years. How in the world could that be a problem? But then when I read the research studies, I was amazed. Yes, it was very clear that a number of clinical trials had been done. So that was what led us to develop a comprehensive nutritional supplement. Our first study over 20 years ago showed good benefit. And since then, we've been working on improving it. So I formed a nonprofit 13 years ago to distribute the supplement based on our research that helps about 3/4 of children and adults with autism. So bottom line is that many people in the US have nutritional deficiencies. They're not eating enough vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, and they need, just the general public often has deficiencies in key vitamins. And then also people with autism, it turns out, because of metabolic problems, have an extra need. So just for example, 90% of children with autism have a lack of sulfate. That's the fourth most common mineral in your body, and it's needed to detoxify many toxic substances, including many of those that I mentioned that come from bacteria and yeast in your gut.
So were you already a scientist when your daughter developed autism?
Yes, I was a professor and became chair of material science and engineering at Arizona State University. I was given the honor of being a presidential professor. I'd received an award from President George Bush, US president, for the research that we were doing. But I gave all of that up to focus on looking at the causes of autism, how to treat it. And we've run many clinical trials. We published over 70 research studies on our work. We've received grants from many organizations, US government, and especially many private foundations and many private families. Over 1,000 families have donated to support our research. So we're very grateful to them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We're going to turn it back over to Julie, has some questions for moms.
Samantha, can you tell us a bit about your journey and what helped your son to thrive?
Well, it's kind of a long, extensive one. It started out with a lot of food allergies. That was the early symptoms. And when I got back from the doctor, because I was a breastfeeding mom, I literally went into the kitchen and looked through my entire cabinet, and I realized that there were common allergens in nearly everything that we had. And I was a single mom at the time. And so I literally had a breakdown and started crying in the middle of the kitchen because I didn't know how to cook from scratch, and I was now being required to do so. So once I had my moment, I got on the journey of making things from scratch and really dove into what was in the food, not just the food itself. So one of the factors, to my surprise, is my mom was watching my older son, and one of the no foods was strawberries. And she had given him one when I wasn't home. And I got there and, they were all cut up and he was eating them. And I ran in and I was like, oh my gosh, no. He can't have strawberries. And surprisingly, there was no reaction. And I was like, how was that possible? That came up as an allergy. And so I went and grabbed the strawberries and looked at the container and I was like, organic. And it never occurred to me that there was a difference. I mean, that they sell them, but I didn't know what made the biggest difference. And then I learned about all the herbicides and pesticides that were utilized in our agricultural sector. And for that particular thing, he was actually reacting to the herbicides and pesticides. So fast forward, we got symptoms got better, and then they got much worse. We had moved into a different community, and he started displaying a myriad of different symptoms, GI, gut health issues. He had a rash, eczema. He started having rage and mood swings that were pretty uncontrollable. And I knew something had changed because he had gotten better once we eliminated all those foods. We were still on a healthy diet, but something in the environment had changed. And so I went on an investigation to figure out what that possibly could be. So initially, I just started tracking everything, where we went, what we ate, who we visited, moon cycles, weather patterns. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I took a very scientific approach. And after 3 months, I found a pattern. Every time the landscaping professionals came, my family and I became ill. And then it led me to look into what types of chemicals they were using. And to my surprise, they were using glyphosate-based herbicide, which at the time was commonly called Roundup, and 2,4-D. 2,4-D is a component of Agent Orange. And they were spraying that in our yards. And I lived in an HOA, and they were spraying that all on the rocks. And my kid loved to play in the rocks. Like, what little kid doesn't like to pick up the rocks? And so his symptoms got extreme for a long time until we actually ended up having to move. And I know that's the story for some families. For certain exposures, we were getting inundated by these herbicides because our HOA was spraying, our freeway was spraying, the city was spraying. That all of these chemicals have, you build up a toxic burden. And so some of the things that we went through was different levels of supplementation, a lot of different minerals, because glyphosate and other herbicides and pesticides in that category deplete the body of nutrients, because glyphosate itself is a mineral chelator, which means binds to and makes unavailable to the body a lot of essential nutrients, copper, magnesium, and several others. And so by putting those back in, it's like the lights in his eyes came back on. And there was one moment that like changed my path. And I didn't mention it, but I wanted to. He had a horrible breakdown, and I literally watched the lights in his eyes go out. It's like his head went back and the lights in his eyes went out. And I knew I had to do something. And I knew that we needed to make a change. And I knew that even though they were sold on the shelves and things like that, that there was something in them that was making my son ill. I just continued supplementation, and he started getting better. We did have to move, and we did different things like cranial sacral therapy and other types of alternative therapies that really made a difference in improving his health, but making sure that the environmental exposures and things that were happening inside the house and outside the house were just as important, like in eliminating different personal care products and switching to organic, non-toxic, as well as making sure that ourselves and our neighbors were not using any of chemical herbicides, because it would lead him to go into other episodes. So it is an ongoing process, and healing the gut was fundamental in changing his behaviors.
So for Dr. Adams, I know you talked a little bit about this already, but can you tell us a bit about the research projects you have worked on over time and what you have discovered? I know there's quite a bit, but I think the one, especially the comprehensive nutrition and diet one that you did, was quite interesting, and there's quite a few others. So not sure which ones you already covered, but whatever you can share.
Yeah, with 70 published studies, it's a little hard to summarize, but you brought up one of the studies we had done, which I think very much addresses the point of comprehensive nutritional support. So we did a 12-month study where we began with our special vitamin mineral supplement and then added in essential fatty acids from fish oil. There are over a dozen studies showing that children with autism are low in omega-3s, and 4 studies showing that giving a little bit helps a little bit. In our study, we gave a lot more, and it helped a lot more. So that omega-3s are very important for the membrane of every cell in your body. And most people just don't get enough because the only major source is from fish. The third treatment we added was carnitine. We had previously done a randomized double-blind study showing that carnitine helped about half of children with autism. What it does is it basically boosts mitochondrial function. It helps support the major energy production for the body. Most people should be able to make carnitine, but some children with autism seem to have a problem producing it. So children who are low energy or are not eating beef, which is the main source of carnitine in the diet, then about half of them would likely benefit from carnitine supplements. Then we added in Epsom salt baths and magnesium sulfate. So very simple to just add it to a bath water and have the child soak in that. And that's a good way to substantially increase absorption of sulfate. And again, as I mentioned, sulfates the major nutritional deficiency in children with autism. And then we added in a digestive enzyme because many children with autism have problems with digestion. 3 major studies by gastroenterologists show that they have low levels of certain carbohydrate enzymes, especially lactase, the enzyme needed to digest the sugar in milk. So that's one of the reasons, one of several reasons to avoid dairy, because some children with autism are just lactose intolerant. And then finally, just going on a healthy, allergen-free diet, so gluten-free, dairy-free, corn-free, soy-free, and also organic as much as possible, because wouldn't you rather have your food without pesticides? And slowly, gradually, over that course of a year, the treatment group gained 18 months of development, whereas the non-treatment group gained only 4 months of development. The treatment group gained 7 points of IQ. The non-treatment group, their IQ didn't change. There are many other improvements, but the bottom line is that just through nutritional support alone, as it was being discussed, that can help many children. Just a good, healthy diet, avoiding the common allergens. A good way to know what your common allergens are, because it's very different from one person to another. For one person, peanuts could be fatal. For another person, like my brother, shellfish can be fatal. So identifying or knowing what are the common allergens out there, and then going on an allergen-free diet, seeing if it helps improve symptoms, and then adding them back in one by one to see if they're a problem. That's the gold standard to know if you have an allergic reaction.
Can you tell us a bit about which approaches you have found had the highest success rates based on all of your research studies and biomedical approaches to autism? What have you found is probably one of the more important things you could share with the people watching?
Well, one of the things I mentioned was nutritional supplementation, but as Dr. Centers was saying, diet is also very important. We did a survey of 1,200 autism families and put the results onto an app available on iPhones, just available from what's called the ANRC Autism Treatment Radar app. It rates 1,200 families' opinions about many medications, many supplements, many diets, and therapies. And so there are many things out there that are helpful, but specialized diets, certainly one very popular thing to try, highly rated by families, and very rare to cause adverse effects. We rated many psychiatric medications, and they have some benefit, but also relatively high rate of adverse effects. Nutritional supplements are in general had higher benefits than psychiatric medications and much less side effects. So if you ask me what were the major treatments that we found that have been beneficial, I'd say again that comprehensive nutritional approach I just mentioned is one. The other big area, though, equally big, and perhaps even more important, is our work on microbiota transplant. That, as I mentioned, we've determined that roughly 90% of children with autism have very high levels of toxic metabolites in their body. The Autism Research Institute, when they did a survey of 25,000 people, the top 2 rated medications, they said, were 2 antifungals. And there are half a dozen research studies, including ours, that show about 25 to 50% of children with autism have a hidden yeast infection. The only symptom is not a gut symptom. Yeast doesn't seem to cause GI issues generally. The only symptom is just worse autism symptoms. And so antifungals have been very effective. I wish there had been some formal research studies of them, but so far the federal government hasn't agreed to fund any of that work. But many physicians have reported that it's beneficial to them. Many families have said it's very beneficial to use antifungals once they've determined that they have a yeast infection. They usually have to follow it up with a low sugar diet because yeast is very resistant in attacking the body's immune system, so it can easily come back.
Can you tell us a bit about your approach and what you have found to be beneficial for reducing autism symptoms? So I'm going to start with Dr. Centers.
We look at the whole child. So it's very important to examine the child, look for deficiencies within the child's diet, look for deficiencies within the child's body, look for problems within the metabolism. And of course, as an osteopath, I look especially at the way the brain is functioning. So we may look at primitive reflexes. We may look at the structure of the body. And then we may look at how they are metabolizing things. So some of these issues with metabolism actually have a genetic basis. So we will frequently look at the methylation cycle and the sulfation cycle, which Dr. Adams talked about. The most common issue in the methylation cycle is called methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase deficiency, or MTHFR. And when a child has an MTHFR problem, they are more likely to have problems with being able to eliminate toxins in their environment. So those children that have an MTHFR problem, they will have a history of midline defects. Many times, I would say 60 to 70% of the patients that I have, they will have a history of a tongue tie. And oftentimes that's not diagnosed until they're older. So they will also have sometimes a history of a sugar bite, which is a little blue spot on the forehead or somewhere on the skull. And they may have other kinds of midline defects, such as spina bifida occulta, which is a hidden form of spina bifida. And those children are much more likely not to be able to get rid of toxins, like toxins from the environment, toxins from their diet, like glyphosate. And I think that that's one of the underlying issues in autism. So, and if we can correct the problem, then we can address the issues and supplement those children with the things that they need.
Can you tell us a bit about the phenotypic changes you are seeing in kids with autism that you've been working with over time, and what you're seeing has been changing? I think you mentioned something about mold. If you could talk a bit more about that, or other changes you're seeing phenotypically.
So we are seeing more children being affected by mold. And when I was in California, I used to practice in California, mold occasionally was related to autism, but it wasn't as common as it is today. So in children here in Arizona, a lot of them are affected by mold. And mold toxicity is just another toxin that these children have problems eliminating. And so if you see a child that is not responding to the typical biomedical approach, then one of the things you really want to check for is mold toxicity. From what I can tell, children with autism are much more sensitive to environmental toxins, the environment itself. And so that's why once you take those things out of the body, for example, we just discovered mold in one of my patients that's down in Florence. And once the mold was eliminated from the environment and we started treating it, within days the child improved. The child began speaking where he speaking in whole sentences, whereas the child had only one or two words before. Other patients, other children who are having really rare or off the beaten path symptoms and come with all sorts of diagnoses. And when we look into it a little bit deeper, sometimes we find mold.
Okay. And you think that they're more sensitive because of the transsulfuration and methylation pathways?
Methylation is a way that we get rid of toxins, and the end product is glutathione. And so, relatively speaking, those children who have a methylation problem, and there can be many different methylation problems. It's not just MTHFR. And the end product of methylation is a molecule called glutathione. And what does glutathione do? It binds to toxins, heavy metals, pesticides, and takes them out of the body. So if you are deficient in glutathione, then your body can't really get rid of those toxins that you're being exposed to.
So in theory, you could build up those, you could address those, issues with those pathways, right? And then they would be maybe more resilient to mold and
Exactly.
other
And
environmental
then,
factors.
methylation is actually a methyl group is a carbon with 3 hydrogens. And how that is used in your biochemistry is that these methyl groups, these carbons with 3 little hydrogens on them, they turn on and they turn off enzymes. So if you are missing the enzymes, if you're missing certain parts of the gene, which we call SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms, then, and they can be just a one interchange of one amino acid with another amino acid, then you won't have the enzyme that will turn on the molecules that you need to detoxify.
Dr. Adams mentioned the Epsom salt baths. That was pivotal in my son's journey. I will say that we had to start really low on the amounts because it made him really hyper. And in many kids, it's calming. But if those that are having a bunch of symptom expression, I had to start with a very small amount, just a couple of tablespoons initially, and then work up to a cup of Epsom salt. But that really helped him, his nervous system calm down and help the detox pathways. Much like Dr. Centers mentioned, with the tongue ties, both my sons actually had tongue ties. We went ahead and took care of that because the midline defect doesn't just affect like the tongue and speech and stuff, which my son didn't have any speech issues, but it actually, because it's a midline, it affected the whole body. Like he couldn't touch his toes before that. After he got it done, he could touch his toes. And in doing that, there was actually some decompression in the whole cranial sacral areas that we got cranial sacral therapy complementary to releasing all of that tension that was held in the body from having the tongue tie. And he also had some detox pathway issues, which, like Dr. Centers said, the toxins have a higher prevalency for building up in children that are more sensitive. I feel like our children are really the canaries. We're all impacted, but not all of us are expressing them as strongly as our children nowadays, just because there's also the compounding effect because, my grandmother was exposed, my mother was exposed, I was exposed, and now he carries that toxic burden forward. So doing these different toxin screenings, like I've had heavy metal testing, I've had mold, we had issues with mold. And so being very conscious of the other aspects in the environment is vitally important for sustained health. One thing that causes my son to react even now is if he accidentally has any fortified foods. So that is not always commonly talked about in the importance of, people that have detoxing gene issues, that you have to avoid the fortified cereals. I mean, it's flours. I mean, it's in everything. So anytime they have any of those synthetic vitamins, if your child is sensitive, just avoid it. We have so many good alternatives now comparatively than when I started this journey nearly 13 years ago. So it takes time to do your research, and you have to be your own investigator and advocate for your children's health or your family's health, because it's not limited to the kids. Because usually if the child has symptoms, then one or both parents will also have them. We just learn to cope with them differently or don't address them because we grew up that way and they're not as significant as our children. But once we adjust the child's needs and we start adopting those things, the adults heal too.
Samantha, what did you find to be the most helpful for you, for your son on your journey with him? What approaches were the most beneficial, would you say?
Much of what Dr. Adams and Dr. Centers and even yourself had said about focusing on diet like going organic was vitally important. It wasn't a nice to have, it's a must, because he does have the detoxing gene and sensitivity for that. We all do. If you can, it's very important, at least an 80-20 on organic, so that you can keep your body as clean as possible. And looking at the other environmental factors was vitally important for sustained health. Because we can do mineral supplementation every day of the week, but if you're in a community like an HOA that sprays herbicides for weed control on a regular basis, like here in Arizona, sometimes during certain months, that's as much as every 2 weeks that they're coming. You're never going to get your stores up because your exposure is so high. So it's really important to not only advocate and do what you can at home, but eventually taking it outside to make those changes in your community. And that's the approach I took, which, I had my own organization that I eliminated glyphosate-based herbicide and switched to organic, non-toxic alternatives in 3 cities, multiple HOAs, and over 200 golf courses. So it's really continuing the conversation, because we're not the only families being impacted, but our kids are just the ones that are alerting us that there's things that are happening in our communities. So eliminating as much as those toxic exposures as I can. And, now my son is 12. So another fundamentally important part is teaching him how to advocate for himself, because I won't always be there. So knowing why and really being responsible and sharing why it's important to not eat gluten, why it's important not to have dairy. And it's not about perfection, but it's about him knowing that the body will express a symptom if he has too much. Whereas when he was a child, he couldn't even have like a pinch of it. Now he has a lesser reaction over time. So he can have small amounts, like if he was at a birthday party. And so really the different complementary options that really made a huge difference for him is like we did some alternative therapies like brain balance, which was fundamentally important in him regulating both sides of the brain. And they have all different types of activities they do for held reflexes, the primitive reflexes, because he had a handful that he needed to move through. And we also did like remedial therapy. He went to Waldorf school. So that was really helpful in some of those behavioral aspects that expressed, but keeping the supplementation. And one that was important for him was vitamin B. He needed that. I believe it's B6, and maybe one of the other doctors can chime in. It's like B6, B12, and maybe B3. That made it a world of difference for calming his body and also helping his body convert, because there's a cofactor in there that is needed in order to get levels of other things up, and making sure that he gets adequate sunshine, even if he's supplementing with D. And again, it's more of a long journey. It's not something that abruptly stops, because as he develops, and he's about to hit puberty right now, and so there's different things that we have to factor in to make sure that he knows how to keep his body healthy, and we continue supporting him so he can continue to thrive, because he used to have a lot of behavioral issues, and now he functions in a regular public school, and he's the top of his class. And when we started this, I didn't think that was a possibility because he was so debilitated.
What do you tell the parents who say that diet has become too restrictive, and either there's not enough nutrition, insufficient nutrition, social, or situations at home make it extra stressful for the child? And where do they go from there with diet?
90% of the serotonin in the human body is produced in the gut, in your intestines. So, and that's pretty significant because in the exogenous opioids, which means that these peptides that are produced from the incomplete digestion of milk and wheat, is the primary cause of these very high serotonin levels that we see in autism. So normally when you eat something like milk or you eat wheat, the food is taken into your stomach and it's broken apart into these small peptides. And then it goes into your small intestine and then to your large intestine. And in the small intestine, you should have enzymes that break these down to amino acids, and then they cross over into your intestines and they're absorbed by the blood. So if you don't have the proper amount of enzymes, or you have a candida problem, or you have a clostridia problem, candida is a yeast and clostridia is a bacteria, then what can happen is these peptides that are broken apart initially in the stomach, they cross directly over into your intestines. And because of their size and their shape, they stimulate the opiate receptors. And the stimulation of the opiate receptors increases the serotonin within the body. And then you have this massive surge of serotonin. So serotonin is a brain chemical, even though most of your serotonin is produced in the gut. And when you have too much serotonin, then you go into a self-focused state, which is very similar to what we see in autism. It's almost similar to what we see in someone that is taking LSD, because what happens with LSD is that the LSD binds to your serotonin receptors and you have this huge increase in serotonin. So we kind of see the same thing in children with autism.
And I think Samantha had a comment she wanted to add to the conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo some of the information, but from a parenting perspective, like the limited diet, something that made a huge difference, especially early on when he had a very narrow diet. We had a occupational therapist that said I needed to introduce new foods up to 21 times. So being consistent and persistent and only putting a little bit, and then like initially it just had to sit on the plate, and then he would have to taste it, and he could use a pinky or something fun. And I got a fun plate, so it looked like a construction site, so that he would play with it. And so getting him to play with it first was an early sign before he actually would try it. And then getting creative with introducing new foods, like making a pasta sauce, but putting in carrots and other vegetables and things like that. After being exposed to it for a while, his body would start craving the carrot, even though it was hidden in something else. So that was really important, is just keep trying and don't force it. Otherwise, they tend to have a little bit more resistance, just be the personality. So it's important to be consistent and try new things. And again, it's just about tolerating it at first, not necessarily eating it. And it's about consistency and keep trying. And then finding creative ways to hide it, or making it, like I would make fruit leather, or I'd make crackers and hide vegetables or other fruits in there. And as he was exposed, he would request the food that was in there, even though he didn't know it was in there, if that makes sense. And then one thing that I noticed is after being exposed to the landscaping chemicals, one of the early signs that I knew my son had an exposure is he would have massive sugar cravings. And I believe that that is directly related to the die-off that happens in the gut, and making it imbalanced from these particular toxins, whether we're eating them with food or inhaling them from yard chemicals, or the kids that are playing with them, is that creates that imbalance, that yeast activity, because he would immediately crave sugar. That was the first, he would go carb crazy after an exposure to the yard chemicals. So the Roundups, and it's not limited to glyphosate. It's any of that category of biocide. So any chemicals that are engineered to kill, that whole thing has an effect on our biology. So it's really important to notice that if it's a sudden change in the diet, they're suddenly craving foods, you can always look and see if anything changed in the environment. And then it was really important to reseed the gut. So putting back the good microbes, whether you're doing that with, the different kefirs or the sauerkraut juice, or, if they like kimchi, or yogurt, or even a probiotic, a good spore probiotic, made a huge difference in opening up his palate over time.
So Dr. Adams, can you tell me a little bit more about your new diagnostic test?
So it measures a a wide number of different microbial metabolites, both from bacteria and yeast. The bacterial metabolites, what they have in common is these are corrupted versions of the precursors to important amino acids, important neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin. And so the bacteria act on these precursors and make corrupted versions that are chemically very similar but different. And so they go on to affect general serotonin and dopamine metabolism. Those neurotransmitters are very important for everything from your mood to your cognition, learning, memory. And then serotonin goes on to make melatonin, which is a hormone that regulates sleep. And that's why we believe most children with autism and many adults with autism have major problems with sleep, either falling asleep or nighttime wakening. And so our test measures many of these metabolites, and we've set very high cutoffs. And so we have set the cutoff so high that no typical child has levels within those cutoffs, but 90% of children with autism have one or more, usually several, of these metabolites above the level of any typical child. And so we've then added on to these individual measurements. If you then look at not just each individual measurement, but you look at all of them, then if a child has one or more of these metabolites, and that's consistent with being on the autism spectrum. So we call it a screening test. It's not a full diagnostic, but it's a screening test that catches 90% of children with autism and 0% of typical kids in our pilot studies. It's based on over 40 published research studies showing that high levels of these metabolites are common in children with autism. But what we've done is just put them all together into one test. Also, a special bonus of the test is that it also measures gluten and casein peptides. So as Dr. Centers was saying, some children with autism have problems digesting the large molecules of gluten and casein and breaking it down into individual amino acids. And so this test measures the level of those peptides. And if they occur, that's pretty strong evidence that you should be considering a gluten or casein diet, a gluten-free or casein-free diet. So that's a quick summary of the test. And what it can do then is help guide you. Do you need antifungal treatment, or do you need some type of probiotic bacterial treatment, especially microbiota transplant, we believe is very helpful, but we need a lot more research to figure out the best ways to fight the bacteria. We have a couple mini videos on my website that talk in more detail about many treatment options that are out there based on the test. Our dream is that the same way that every child in the U.S. gets a heel prick the day they're born to test for about 30 rare genetic disorders, we would like to propose every child at about age 2 years has a simple urine collection to check for levels of these harmful yeast and bacterial metabolites, which, if they're present, is a very strong indication that the child is probably on the path towards developing autism. And wouldn't it be nice if you could have a screening test at age 2 rather than waiting typically several years later before they have a formal diagnosis? But it's more than just a diagnosis. It tells you what one of the major problems is. I don't want to say it's the only problem. So there are many other toxins and metabolites in the world that can be harmful. We've heard about some of them: glyphosate, toxic metals, and others, many toxic chemicals. But what's special about these bacterial and yeast metabolites is we have hard evidence, 40 published studies showing that these metabolites are significantly elevated in children with autism. We know that for several of these metabolites, you administer them to mice, they cause autistic symptoms. The one treatment study that's been done, our first microbiota transplant study, showed just what the mouse study did. When we not quite as much, but we found that when we treated children with our microbiota transplant, their gut symptoms improved and their autism symptoms improved. In humans, the development is a lot more complex, so I won't say we fully recovered them, but they improved quite a bit. Whereas in mice, they're simpler developmentally. They seem to fully recover after a gut transplant. Your body has a limit to its ability to detoxify. So
Yes.
in the same way that if you're drinking alcohol, but you're also taking certain prescription medications, that can make it much more dangerous. And so with these metabolites that I mentioned, many of them are detoxified by sulfation. So you have a limit to how much you can detox. Some of the earliest published studies showed that if the standard way to test for detoxification is to give a person acetaminophen, or in the US it's called Tylenol. And in autism, several studies have shown it takes much longer for them to detoxify, presumably because their sulfation pool is so low. We've published a couple of studies showing that. And now we understand the reason their sulfate pool is low is because they're using most of their sulfate to detoxify these toxins from their gut. So there's not enough sulfate left to detoxify many other things. So that's, we believe, a big part of the reason why they're sensitive to salicylates and phenols and other products, because these toxic metabolites I mentioned many of them are phenolic compounds. But also Dr. Centers mentioned glutathione. We've done one of the first major metal detoxification treatments. We've shown that children with autism have low levels of glutathione, and more of it is oxidized. We've demonstrated that our simple vitamin mineral supplement is able to greatly improve that, increase levels of glutathione, and help shift more of it to being the active form, the reduced form. And so that's important because glutathione is needed to remove toxic metals. We published a study showing that when you give a FDA-approved medication, DMSA, to kids with autism, they excrete much more toxic metals than typical kids. And we found that longer-term treatment, slowly, gradually, led to improvements in those children. But we think that's a secondary issue because the amounts of toxic metals, although higher in kids with autism, it's not high enough to account for their all of their symptoms in most cases. Whereas these toxic toxins from gut bacteria and yeast, we think seem very likely because these levels can be 10, 100, 1,000 times higher in kids with autism compared to typical kids in our study. And using a pharmaceutical approach like DMSA, we found that once children's levels had decreased down to normal, toxic metals had decreased down to normal, we needed to stop then because that was when we began to see, then when there's no more toxic metals to be excreted, then the chelators will bind onto essential minerals and deplete those. And that's when you begin to see a little more hyperactivity and other problems.
Dr. Centers, we have a biodynamic cranial sacral therapist wondering which brain structures should they focus on when working on autistic children and adults.
So with biodynamic cranial therapy, that's not my expertise. I am a traditional cranial osteopath, and what we focus on is the third ventricle and the amygdala. So biodynamic therapy is a different approach to how the cerebral spinal fluid flows within the body. And there are different techniques than what traditional cranial osteopaths use.
Next question, do any of the practitioners have experience with stem cell transplants?
I think that the research on stem cell therapy is not proficient at this time. And the children that I have seen, I haven't seen huge improvements. Now, there's also something called exosome therapy. Now, some of those children seem to have more improvements than the stem cell therapy. And also, it depends upon where the stem cell therapy is done. So, for example, a number of years ago, there were people who were going to Vladivostok in Russia, and they were doing the therapy a little bit differently. So there are centers in Panama that I know that a lot of children in the U.S. go to, and I honestly, after spending thousands of dollars, I haven't seen parents have a lot of improvement with stem cell therapy.
There's a question from a pediatrician. Could glutathione patches be used for treatment? And if yes, what is the youngest age, if you're familiar with those?
My personal opinion is that if you're going to give glutathione, I would give it orally. The type of glutathione that we use typically is liposomal glutathione, and we get that primarily from quicksilver.
What about the use of anti-inflammatories as off-label, for instance, as ivermectin? Are any of you using ivermectin, and is it effective?
We have used it in the past for COVID or long COVID, but not really for autism. I don't think that anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen really help with children who have autism, but some of these children who have a diagnosis of autism, they actually have PANS or PANDAS, and which is pediatric acute neuropsychiatric syndrome. And oftentimes that's caused by strep, and it can be caused by viruses like long COVID. It can be caused by Lyme disease or other viral infections. Mycoplasma is not unheard of as a cause of PANS and PANDAS. But in those cases, those children do respond to anti-inflammatories. So if you give a child like ibuprofen and they suddenly improve, then it's more likely that this child has PANS or PANDAS, and that needs to be checked out.
Are kids with PANS or PANDAS sometimes misdiagnosed as autistic, or is it sometimes autistic kids also have those other conditions?
So sometimes children with autism have PANS and PANDAS, and sometimes children with PANS and PANDAS are misdiagnosed as autism because they don't fit any other clinical picture. So that's why the biomedical approach is very important, and you have to actually look for it. So there's also something that I have seen more recently, which is called Hashimoto's encephalitis, which is actually a thyroid antibody problem. So some kids that have this very high anti-thyroid antibodies present with autism and PANDAS symptoms, and the problem really is a thyroid antibody. And that one does respond to steroid therapy, and sometimes the symptoms will go away very dramatically overnight. And the child never had autism, they never had PANS or PANDAS, they had a thyroid problem. So thyroid and thyroid antibodies are a very important thing to do when you're working up a child with autism.
Next, let's talk a little bit about the costs of these treatments. We have a father weighing in. Who can help me as a beginner on this journey with an autistic 3-year-old daughter to outline beginning steps, action plan outline? And the concern is without it costing thousands of dollars, because this particular dad is not wealthy.
Well, you can certainly begin with diet, and cooking things at home can actually be less expensive. And although one can try to purchase pre-made gluten-free foods, on the other hand, rice, vegetables, meats, chicken, cooking dishes like that at home can be inexpensive and can be very healthy. One thing we haven't really mentioned about diet is the importance of having a rainbow of foods. You want to have a very wide range of foods. So I'd begin with that. I think a basic vitamin mineral supplement we found helps, as I said, 3/4 of children with autism. try it for 2 or 3 months to find out. Fish is a great way to get your omega-3s, and again, very important for brain health. You can do a lot of tests, but we think that it's useful just to begin with that first. So those would be my suggestions to start with, but other people may have their own suggestions.
That's helpful. Samantha, you have any thoughts on this?
I would tend to agree with Dr. Adams. I didn't rush into a bunch of testing in the beginning. We made the diet changes, went organic, and started doing the simple things to make it the most affordable, because you'll know you're on the right track because the child starts improving in subtle ways, and getting rid of the gluten and the dairy, and he also had corn, soy, eggs, made a huge difference in some of the behaviors. And then as we got a little further in the journey, obviously I started supplementing around the same time that I introduced the organic diet. So much like Dr. Adams is saying, that made a huge difference as well, and doing the magnesium bath. So you start with what's affordable first, and then you see what symptoms kind of linger. And so there was still some behavioral issues. So I ended up getting like a GI test done, which it is expensive. I want to say it was like $400 or more to do one of those. And then we ended up doing a heavy metals a little bit later on. But you can plan. You do what you can when you start. And I think diet change and doing all those things at home is a great investment. And getting the whole family on board is very vitally important, because they will want the other stuff if it's available in the house. So I think that's a good focus. And then supplementation. And then as you can afford the budget, you can look up the tests and save for it and find a good practitioner in your area that is well versed in this kind of treatment, so that you can focus on your child's specific needs rather than jumping into all the testing, because we haven't done a whole lot. I just tried the protocols and the protocol worked, so we followed that path. And then I just supplemented with what was most important. Chiropractic care was actually really helpful too. And that's an affordable one, and some insurances now cover it. And so it's really about listening to your kid and looking at what in the environment you can change. Like another thing, like laundry detergents, like if you have a sensitive child, laundry detergents, personal care products, you really want to reduce the toxic load as much as you can, because they are way more sensitive than other kids. So anything you can do to reduce the toxic burden, you should start seeing results.
How do you find somebody who you can trust and who has a wealth of experience like the group we've been speaking with today?
One group I'm active with is the MAPS physicians. That stands for Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs, especially the physicians who are fellows or speakers at the MAPS conference are more experienced. But you can go to their website, and they have physicians all around the country. So that's one source to look for. Also, what we've created through our nonprofit, the Autism Nutrition Research Center, is we have not a physician, but we have a consultant, and they can give basic information about some of these basic treatments. They're not physicians, they can't order tests, but they can give you information on much of what we've covered here today.
Okay. And Julie, do you have thoughts on that particular question about finding a local practitioner?
A lot of people now are doing telemedicine, including doctor centers. I work with people internationally. I work with parents internationally, and we see results. So it really, I don't think it has to be location specific. You just want to make sure it's someone that you feel comfortable with, that that you're going to trust, that you can afford. And, if you need to see if they're covered by your insurance or not. And then you just see, what kind of cases they've worked with, and if, they feel like a good fit for you. A lot of times people offer, it depends, but some people do offer free consultations, or you can call the office to learn more about that. So MAPS is probably one of the main ones now. There used to be Dan doctors, but that kind of got disintegrated. So that's probably one of the main databases, or a functional medicine doctor or a naturopath. Those are all options. Yeah.
Thank you, Julie. Ryan, do you have a thought on the cost topic?
Yeah, just wanted to mention some practical examples with families real quick. So, I know it can seem like a lot at the beginning and you feel like you have to do everything. It's a gradual process of good, better, best. That's always going to be changing for you. But I just want to talk about the downstream effects of cost. So it seems expensive up front, but there's a lot of, aside from quality of life for the children, a couple instances where there was a child who was regularly constipated and, over time, even though they would try to use Miralax, sometimes that was not working for them. And, every now and then they would end up in a ER visit in a very inconvenient time in their life. And obviously that was painful for the child. Under that particular situation, one smoothie a day made them regular, and those ER visits didn't happen again. That was just with one smoothie a day. There's another child who I had worked with who was sort of assaulting his father, spitting, breaking glass, having outbursts of aggressive tendencies. And, we found that not even with a perfect gluten-free diet, they just sort of eliminated, gluten and dairy somewhat. Now, I know that's not the ideal situation, but that's what they were working with and could do at the time. They were only able to introduce a couple supplements. They did like CBD and believe it was like Ion Biome. And, they washed a few things in the environment, getting rid of some of those chemicals, like Samantha said, for laundry detergents and such. And with just those minor changes, that child stopped smashing and breaking glass in front of his brother and in front of his family. Again, that would always happen at a very inconvenient time to have a window smashed, the safety, the quality of life. And so that whole family's life improved dramatically with just those little bits of cost investment. So I know it seems like a lot up front, but it will pay off for, your family later. I just wanted to mention.
Yeah, thank you for that. It really is miraculous what some of these small changes can accomplish in these kids. I'm going to merge several questions together because it's about protocols that people have questions about. So wondering about any experience with scalar energies, quantum neurofeedback. I'm going to list several of these. Red light therapy and peptides. So four items there. And I wonder if any of you would like to weigh in on those.
I have some experience with different neurofeedback and neurotechnologies. I'm not familiar with that one specifically. So I only like to talk about ones that I've had experience with, but I really like the Cereset. I had one adult young man on the spectrum that his mom tried that for him. He couldn't leave his room anymore. He was holed up in his room and he was very depressed, had anxiety on top of autism, so co-occurring disorders. And the only suggestion she did out of the things I told her was the Cereset, which is based out of Scottsdale. And she saw some, she called me back a month later and said she got her son back and he was no longer depressed or anxious. He wasn't holed up in his room anymore. So that was pretty miraculous because he was in his young 20s. So that's one that I've seen good success with.
Scalar therapy, we use that in their practice and we do see improvements with it. We use something called a biocharger, which I think is fairly common in Sedona where you are. And we see a lot of improvements with patients when we use it. As far as neuropeptide therapy, this can be beneficial. The most effective therapies are not available here in the US, although I believe that there are some places in Mexico that are doing that therapy. But it's much more common in Russia. And I'm not really certain about its use in Mexico. And I know it's an IV therapy, which I would be a little bit cautious about. So the red light therapy can be very beneficial, especially the infrared light. So if you have a therapeutic grade infrared light, it will penetrate into the skull up to 2 inches, which means that you can actually get into the areas of the brain, such as the basal ganglia, which are affected by autism. And there are studies that show that it causes proliferation of the blood vessels, which increase nitric oxide and oxygenation to the brain, which can make improvements with children who have autism.
I wanted to chime in on the red light therapy. I do, and we still use red light therapy. Another source of red light spikes actually come from CFLs and LED lights. So changing our whole home to incandescents made a huge difference. It actually reduced anxiety, nervousness. It allowed for the children to calm down, and their body's circadian rhythms improved, as well as I had heart palpitations, and it was completely eliminated when I changed the light bulbs. So because they have a high blue light spike, and so when you put in the incandescents, it puts it back in the spectrum of the red. So that helps because we take in the world through our eyes. So that makes a huge difference. And then before, like 10 minutes before, well, right before bed, my son does some red light therapy with a unit that we have at home. And then as far as like alternative therapies, like I haven't used the biocharger or the scalar light, but I have used pranic healing, and there's that's a form of energy healing, and they have protocols specifically for autism, ADHD, and one of the masters, Master Co, actually recovered his kid with pranic healing for these types of issues.
And cranial sacral therapy is another one that has some studies behind it, and they've had case studies, including a girl who she did diet plus, biomedical approaches, nutrition, but also she did an extensive amount of cranial sacral therapy, and the same doctor who originally diagnosed her actually removed the diagnosis after those changes. So that's also beneficial in terms of modalities, body work modalities. Yeah. Well, I just want to thank everyone for their participation. I wish we had more time because there's so much more we could get into. But it was I'm so glad that we were able to do this and to be able to have so many different perspectives and experts on the same panel and share information for these families has been so great. So I appreciate all of your time and for sharing. I think if you want to, we do have some resources on the chd.tv event page. So if you want to learn more about any of the people on the panel or resources they talked about, that's at the bottom of the event page. You can learn more about each of the different people on the panel. And some of their resources there.
Thanks for the panel. Thanks for all the members. Just check out also on the Restoring Balance Autism website. We have some extra episodes of all the great stuff that couldn't make it into the film. So check that out as well.
Thank you, everybody.
There is more and more evidence that there is an immune inflammatory process going on in more than 80% of these children. Find a doctor who understands that autism is medical.
I forget that I see this kind of stuff every day, and I forget that people that don't see these kids every day and see them better don't know that can happen.
I started to read many journal articles. Come to find out there were many journal articles that the doctors weren't reading.
What's going on? Why is it going on? How did this happen?
Most of the research dollars were going into genetics, and I knew there had to be an environmental factor. Gluten intolerance is glyphosate poisoning.
We're bathed in chemicals. Look around you.
We're physically poisoning the earth, and we're physically poisoning the children.
You hear from your conventionally trained doctor that diet has no influence on autism. That's nonsense.
And if you can fix what's wrong with the gut, then your child can learn what they couldn't before.
So we start hitting new levels.
Within 48 hours, he had gone from completely nonverbal, no sounds that even remotely sounded like the English language, to speaking in sentences.
What's that from? What's that from?
Where's that from? Mr. Grasshopper. Which color wiring can do you like?
Flip the right switch and miracles can happen.
Oh my goodness, there's something I can do about this. This is an autoimmune disorder. This is a metabolic disorder. This is a digestive disorder.
It helped me with my life. It actually did. And I think that's just amazing.
And I strongly suggest you open your eyes to possibilities.
What we've done is taken away the things that held them back and made them sick and made them, unable to face the world. Now we're able to see who they really are, and it's beautiful. It's amazing.